Moving on to the next chapter in obligations, the different kinds. Excerpts are from the Law on Obligations and Contracts by De Leon. This is CE Laws, Contracts, and Ethics. There are two general classifications of obligations under the Civil Code. The first is primary classification, which includes pure and conditional obligations, obligations with a period, alternative and facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, and divisible and indivisible obligations. The second is secondary classification, which covers unilateral and bilateral obligations, real and personal obligations, determinate and generic obligations, civil and natural obligations, legal, conventional, and penal obligations. Starting off with Article 1179, every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once. Every obligation which contain a resolutory condition shall also be demandable, without prejudice to the effects of the happening of the event. A pure obligation is one which is not subject to any condition and no specific date is mentioned for its fulfillment and is, therefore, immediately demandable. An example: a man obliges himself to pay somebody 1,000 pesos, where the obligation is immediately demandable because there is no condition and no date is mentioned for its fulfillment. The other is conditional obligation, which is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. A condition is a future and uncertain event, upon the happening of which the effectivity or extinguishment of an obligation or right subject to it depends. The two principal kinds of condition starts with suspensive condition. Suspensive condition is also known as condition precedent or condition antecedent. This is one the fulfillment of which will give rise to an obligation or right. In other words, the demandability of the obligation is suspended until the happening of an uncertain event which constitutes the condition. For example, there are cases that students would have the obligation to help their parents out by shouldering their siblings' education upon getting work. The moment that the students graduate and find a job, their obligation starts. The second is resolutory condition or condition subsequent. This is one the fulfillment of which will extinguish an obligation or right already existing. For instance, parents' obligation to give their children allowance or pocket money ends after their children's graduation from college. A condition really refers only to an uncertain and future event. A past event cannot be said to be a condition since the demandability of an obligation subject to a condition depends upon whether the event will happen or will not happen. Let's take an example. A man is the owner of a parcel of land which is being claimed by his neighbor. Last week, the Supreme Court has rendered a final decision upholding the right of the man. However, the man has not yet received the notice that he had won the case. Now, the man obliged himself to sell his land to an investor, should he win the case against his neighbor. Under the facts, the man would be bound to sell the land to the investor upon receipt of the notice that he had won the case against his neighbor. Article 1180 states, when the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permit him to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period, subject to the provisions of Article 1197. A period is a future and uncertain event upon the arrival of which the obligation subject to it either arises or is extinguished. There are two cases for this. First, the debtor promises to pay when his means permit him to do so. That obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period. In this case, what depends upon the debtor's will is not whether he should pay or not, for indeed he binds himself to pay. What is left only to his will is the duration of the period. The other would be other cases, like little by little, as soon as possible, from time to time, at any time I have the money, in partial payments, or when I am in the position to pay. Obligations with a period would be discussed in the next sections. Article 1181 states, in conditional obligations, the acquisition of rights, as well as the extinguishment or loss of those already acquired, shall depend upon the happening of the event which constitutes the condition. This article reiterates the distinction between a suspensive or antecedent condition or a resolutory or subsequent condition. What would be the effects of happening of condition? First, the acquisition of rights. In obligations subject to a suspensive condition, the acquisition of rights by the creditor depends upon the happening of the event which constitutes the condition. Second, the loss of rights already acquired. In obligations subject to a resolutory condition, the happening of the event which constitutes the condition produces the extinguishment or loss of rights already acquired. Article 1182 says, when the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void. If it depends upon the chance or upon the will of a third person, the obligation shall take effect in conformity with the provisions of this code. There are different classifications of conditions. One would be according to effect. First, suspensive condition. This is the happening of which gives rise to the obligation. Like what was discussed earlier, a student's graduation may signal the start of his obligations to his siblings. Naturally, like the other kind of obligation, resolutory condition is the event which signals the end of an obligation. So with the same example, graduating from tertiary education resolves your parents' obligation to give you allowance. According to form, the first one is express condition, or the condition which is clearly stated. This can be done through writing or verbally. The second is what we call implied condition, or the condition which is merely inferred. In here, we can say actions speak louder than words. Considering the cause or origin, the first is potentiative condition, or the condition which depends upon the will of one of the contracting parties. There are different cases involved in potentiative condition. Where suspensive condition depends upon the will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void because its validity and compliance is left to the will of the debtor, and it cannot, therefore, be easily demanded. In order not to be liable, the debtor will not just fulfill the condition. There is no burden on the debtor, and consequently, no juridical tie is created. If the condition depends exclusively upon the will of the creditor, the obligation is valid. Where resolutory condition depends upon the will of the debtor, like the right to repurchase in a sale with pacta de retro, the obligation is valid although its fulfillment depends upon the sole will of the debtor or the seller. The fulfillment of the condition merely causes the extinguishment or loss of rights already acquired. The debtor is naturally interested in its fulfillment. The next condition, according to cause or origin, is casual condition. If the suspensive condition depends upon chance or upon the will of a third person, the obligation subject to it is valid. For instance, a building contractor obliges himself in favor of the owner to repair at his expense any damage that may be caused to the building by any earthquake occurring within 10 years from the date of the completion of its construction. A third person may be required to indeed check and decide if a repair is required. The last kind of condition according to cause or origin is mixed condition. The obligation is valid if the suspensive condition depends partly upon chance and partly upon the will of a third person. From our same example, where a building contractor obliges himself in favor of the owner to repair at the contractor's expense any damage to the building taking place after an earthquake is found by a panel of arbitrators that construction defects contribute in any way to the damage. Both the conditions must take place in order that the contractor's obligation will arise. The decision of the panel or third party must be accepted by both the contractor and the owner as final unless it can be shown that it was incompetent to act in that capacity or was obviously biased favoring either the owner or the contractor. Another classification of conditions would be as to its possibility. First one would be possible condition, where it is capable of fulfillment legally and physically, such as when you are asked to do some paperwork. Another would be your impossible condition, which is not capable of fulfillment legally or physically, just like when you are asked to fly. Article 1183. Impossible conditions, those contrary to good customs or public policy, and those prohibited by law shall annul the obligation which depends upon them. If the obligation is divisible, that part thereof, which is not affected by the impossible or unlawful condition, shall be valid. The condition not to do an impossible thing shall be considered as not having been agreed upon. This article refers to suspensive conditions. It applies only to cases where the impossibility already existed at the time the obligation was constituted. There are two kinds of impossible conditions. First, physically impossible conditions, when they, in nature of things, cannot exist or cannot be done. For example, an agreement that you are going to receive a sum of money if it will not rain for 1 year in the Philippines. Second, legally impossible conditions, when they are contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Another example, you are going to be having a sum of money if you are going to kill somebody. There are different effects of impossible conditions. First, conditional obligations void. Impossible conditions annul the obligation which depends upon them. Both the obligation and the condition are void. The reason behind the law is that the obliger knows his obligation cannot be fulfilled. He has no intention to comply with his obligation. Second, conditional obligation is valid. If the condition is negative, that is, not to do an impossible thing, it is disregarded and the obligation is rendered pure and valid. Actually, the condition is always fulfilled when it is not to do an impossible thing, so that it is the same as if there were no condition. Third, only the affected obligation is void. If the obligation is divisible, the part thereof not affected by the impossible condition shall be valid. Lastly, only the condition void. If the obligation is a pre-existing obligation and, therefore, does not depend upon the fulfillment of the condition which is impossible for its existence, only the condition is void.